Machaim ninan b'chadaluhu sharirom Abo agid kullo budo deshmayo adarvo Ad kulhin ailid metchazion vadlo metchazion Vabchat morio yeshum shiho Igidoyo brod adoho Haudmen abo yesilek dom kulhun olmim Nuhrod men nuhro aloho sharirod men aloho shariro Ilido lobido vashve busia labud bide hokul Haudume dolodan.
We believe in one true God. These are the words with which the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed begins. Creeds can simply be understood as a set of doctrinal statements that would answer the question, what do you believe? Of course, creeds mean much more than that. Even though the word creed comes from the Latin credo, which means I believe, the Greek term symbolum was the one largely used in the West to denote creeds. Symbolum carried several different meanings, such as a summary of faith, a token, a contract, a sign, and so on. In the East, however, creeds were called ekthesis tes pisteos, exposition of the faith, or just simply pistis, which means faith. As we look at the historical development of creeds in the early church, we encounter the interrogatory creedal exchanges that took place in the context of baptism. Declaratory creeds originated later in the context of dogmatic crises and councils. Let us hear more on this from Professor Dr. Wolfram Kinzig, Professor of Church History at the Faculty of Protestant Theology at the University of Bonn, Germany.
So, what are the purposes of the creed? Initially, I think the idea was when you had people who wanted to convert to Christianity and they then started the catechumenate, the initial phase of getting acquainted with Christianity, they were taught about the basics of Christianity. And then at the baptism or before baptism, they were asked some questions, usually 3 questions, but perhaps also more, about the contents of what they'd learned. So creeds, one of the origins of a creed is simply to ascertain the knowledge about Christian basic truths. But then we also have a number of doctrinal sentences that are repeated in various versions and that are then called the rule of faith at the end of the 2nd century, 3rd century, a sort of a collection of doctrinal sentences that are being quoted in order to defend a certain type of Christianity, which is then later called Orthodox Christianity, from deviant forms of Christianity. So we have a basic arsenal, as it were, of sentences about God, about His Son, about the Holy Spirit, that are then used to determine what is Christian, what is Orthodox Christianity, and what isn't. And later again, probably perhaps in the 4th century, creeds then are clearly fixed. Before they were still quite fluid. In the 4th century, at the latest, they're fixed. They are decided upon at synods, and they define orthodoxy in a very strict manner. Bishops have to subscribe to the creeds, give their signatures that they agree with the content of the faith. And people still learn these creeds when they convert to Christianity, and then later, when they want to go to attend Mass, they're being asked at the Eucharistic part of Mass whether they know the creed, and that gives them access to the innermost part of the service, the Eucharistic service. Non-baptized Christian, unbaptized Christians can also take part in the liturgy of the Word, which precedes the Eucharist, but the Eucharist itself can only be given to those who are baptized, and the way you prove that you are baptized is that that the creed is being said at the beginning of the Eucharistic service. So these are some of the functions of the creed in the early church.
Over the centuries, the purpose of creeds has evolved, and they have also become part of the Eucharistic liturgy. In several traditions, creeds have become more or less a prayer, which is regularly recited during worship. However, one must be careful not to overlook the fact that creeds are also to be explored as theological and historical artifacts, which could open a window to a repository of knowledge on the history of Christianity. Let us begin by asking, what's in a creed?
Now, what is really fascinating when you study the creeds is, you still find new creeds, new formulae of summarizing the creed, because the Creed of Nicaea, Constantinople, and the Apostles' Creed are not the only creeds that were produced in early Christianity. They're not recited today anymore, but there were many other formulae. So the more we look into the manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, the more creeds we find. But then also when you study the creeds and you try to understand why they were formulated the way they were actually phrased then you discover that this develops in a complex situation of a theological debate, B, a political debate within the church. You can see the various patriarchates developing and arguing with each other. And thirdly, the relation between the church and the empire, because the emperors were involved in these debates. For example, Constantine summoned the Council of Nicaea in 325 and was apparently also involved in actually formulating the Nicene Creed of 325. Theodosius summoned the Council of 381. And then at later ecumenical councils, they were also summoned by the emperors. So, but there's more than that. You can see, for example, how creeds were used in daily life. How often they were recited. People were expected to know at least the creed and the Lord's Prayer. And then these texts developed into sacred texts which people kept as amulets, for example, or which they used as kind of magical charms to increase the efficacy of herbs, for example. Or they like phylacteries, they placed them on at the doorstep somehow to protect a house. Studying the creeds opens up a whole array of different perspectives on Christian life in antiquity.
J. N. D. Kelly's monograph, Early Christian Creeds, first published in 1950, is still considered a benchmark when it comes to research on the history and development of ancient creeds. In recent years, scholarship on creeds has made much progress with actual discoveries of new texts and the publication of a large number of monographs and articles. In light of recent research, there is a call for a new perspective on creeds.
Now, research into the creeds has developed in recent years at quite a fast pace. We had a period of research in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries, with famous people being involved. For example, Adolf von Harnack or Hans Lietzmann and others. Before that, Karl Kaspari as well. And many others, and then this was sort of came to a first synthesis by the famous book by J.N.D. Kelly on early Christian creeds, and this appeared in its third edition in 1972, and then everything seemed to have been said about this issue, about the development of the creeds. But as it happened then later, people turned again to this question of, because some questions had been remained unsolved, especially what was unclear is why in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries the creed was still not yet fixed, whereas in the 4th century we have these fixed formulae where no single word must be changed. That was the idea later, that the Creed of Nicaea must not be changed one little bit. So how did this change come about? And how did then creeds develop in the 4th century? Because you have then successively many different such creedal formulations until this development then ends in Constantinople 381. And then Marcus Vincent published a famous book on where he showed that how the creeds developed in the 14th century, that although people were opposing each other, they used each other's creeds and built upon those creeds and sort of developed those creeds. And then something else happened, that one of the first witnesses for the Roman Creed, which is the predecessor of what we call the Apostles' Creed, one of the first witnesses disappeared for certain reasons, which I can't explain here. And we thought we had an early witness from the 2nd century, but then this became very questionable. Though the question arose again, where does the Roman Creed actually come from? When is it first formulated? And Marcus Vincent then developed the theory that it was indeed formulated by a theologian called Marcellus of Ancyra, who first formulated it in a letter to Pope Julius of Rome in 340 or 341. And the irony is that Marcellus was later condemned a heretic. So the point of Marcus's thesis was that the Roman Creed was actually formulated by a heretic, right? But this theory, although it was very original, and it sparkled a lot of new interest in the early history of the creeds, was not entirely convincing for various reasons. I first agreed with it, and we wrote an article together, Marcus and I, where I supported this idea, but I've become more skeptical meanwhile. I think the Roman Creed is old, it does indeed go back to the 3rd century, and I think new arguments can be found why this is the case. So here you have a new beginning in the history of the creeds. And then we had an old, a very old collection of creedal texts which definitely needed to be revised and re-edited. And that's what I did in 4 volumes for Oxford University Press. I collected creeds in order to then write a new history of the creeds on the basis of what we'd found meanwhile. Other things happened. We found that or I found that in Constantinople in 381, apparently various versions of the creed were being discussed, and we found, I found a new version which was discussed in Constantinople. So we have a much clearer picture of how the creed was, the Nicene Creed was revised in Constantinople in 381. Then there were other things. We explored the use of the creed in everyday life. New articles were written about the emperors and the development of the faith. For example, why emperors then start using the creed in laws and then prescribe certain definitions of the faith for the whole population of the whole empire. So all these developments, and then we have an enormous number of explanations of the creed, Latin explanations of the creed from the early Middle Ages that were being edited for the first time, printed, and where we can see how people then interpreted the Apostles' Creed or the predecessor of the Apostles' Creed. We have the Apostles' Creed as we know it now is perhaps 7th century, so quite late, but the Roman Creed develops into the Apostles' Creed. So this development is now much clearer. So all these new discoveries led to a renewed interest in the history of the creeds.
Research on ancient creeds could make valuable contributions to the field of ecumenism. On one hand, it would bring to light the historical situations and doctrinal debates that led to the formation of creeds, and on the other hand, it could be used as a common platform to build up ecumenical dialogues aiming at visible unity among the churches. For example, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed can be considered as a universally accepted ecumenical symbol of faith, as most denominations would accept the teaching it advocates. As J.N.D. Kelly observes, it is thus one of the few threads by which the tattered fragments of the divided robe of Christendom are held together.
Yes, in the 20th century, it has also been at the heart of the Creed of Nicaea Constantinople has been at the heart of ecumenical dialogue, for example, in the Commission on Faith and Order, which precisely is called On Faith and Order because matters of faith are being discussed here. And the Creed of Nicaea Constantinople has often served as a basis for conversation with, especially between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, but also has been, over the centuries, been a matter of dispute and discontent, because there was a great debate over centuries, really, many centuries indeed, about the role of the Holy Spirit in the Creed. Does the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father, as it is said in the original Greek text, or does it proceed from the Father and the Son, which is in Latin is called filioque, and the Son? And that's the so-called filioque controversy, which contributed to, was not the only reason, but it contributed to a split between the Roman Catholic Church and the medieval Western Church and the Orthodox churches. Now these differences, which are difficult to understand and which one perhaps doesn't have to understand really, these differences of opinion nowadays have been largely overcome, and it is mutually recognized, and one can speak the Creed of Nicaea and Constantinople as the Holy Spirit as proceeding either from the Father or from the Father and the Son. And thus the Creed has become once again a common language which is shared in East and West. But I also see challenges in ecumenical debate. I think that in recent years matters of doctrine have receded into the background. Matters of practical Christianity have come to the fore, which is fine. But at the same time, we also find a certain criticism of theology and of metaphysics within the churches, and it is important to, especially in conversation with evangelical Christians, to emphasize that just to sort of stick to the letter of the Bible is not sufficient to explain what the Bible is saying about Christ and about God in a coherent manner. But in order to be able to do that, you need theology. And the creeds can help to structure speaking about the Christian faith and Christian metaphysics, and to explain why just simply taking the New Testament at its word, as it were, is not sufficient to be able to explain how God works in this world. you have to have some sort of academic reflection upon this to be able to also explain it to non-Christians or to either atheists or people of other faiths, right?
Research on ancient creeds remains wide open, with a considerable number of new routes left unexplored. Any attempt to study creeds leads one to a daunting task of dealing with multi-dimensional aspects of the early church, such as patristics, political history, theological debates, liturgical development, philosophy, and many more. Creeds are thus significant not only from an ecclesiastical perspective, but from academic and ecumenical perspectives as well.